This is the second worked example for writing classes. So far, we have named, defined our instance and class level variables. Now we'll continue with what's next. Subgoal 6 is to create constructors or behavior that creates the initial state of the object. For all constructors, they should be public, they have the same name as the class, there is no return type, not even void. For a default constructor, it has no parameters. The logic inside the constructor should be to initialize all variables to a valid state, and then you can repeat as needed, adding other constructors by adding parameters so each overloaded constructor has a different signature or parameter list. Our problem again is that we're writing a class to represent an instance of time. The attributes have been declared. In this video, we will now write a default and overloaded constructor. This is our UML. We are now down to the third portion of the box where you can see we have added two constructors. We know they are constructors because the name of the method is the same name as the class. Notice the first one is public and has no parameters. It will be a default constructor. The second one is overloaded and takes 3 parameters, 3 integers. We will call that a specific or overloaded constructor. Let's start with the default constructor. Subgoal 6. First, we have to declare the default constructor as public. We know its name because it's the same name as the class time type. It has no return type, and for the default constructor, it has no parameters. The logic inside is to initialize all variables to a logical state. In this case, we will initialize our 3 attributes, hour, minute, and second, all to have an initial value of 0. Now let's tackle the overloaded constructor. For the overloaded constructor, again it's public, it has the same name as the class, and it has no return type. In this case, it has 3 parameters, 3 integers. We can decide what order we want to put them in. In this case, we will do hour, minute, then second. Notice that the names of the parameters in the parameter list are different than the names of the instance attributes. The instance attributes were hour all spelled out, minute all spelled out, and second all spelled out. We've created different names for the parameter list to make them distinguishable from the attributes. Now we want to do the logic. For this example, we want to ensure that the variables that we bring in as parameters have valid values before we assign them to our instance attributes. So for the case of hour, the first parameter, it needs to be between 0 and 23 inclusive. So we check that before we assign the value to our instance attribute hour. Min has to be between 0 and 59 inclusive before we assign it to the instance attribute minute, and sec has to be between 0 and 59 inclusive before we assign it to the instance attribute second. It's always important to make sure that any data that comes in as parameters is validated before assigning it to an instance attribute. Now that we have defined our constructors, we can begin our test code, or what would go in a driver like main. Here we have declared 2 new instances of the time type class, one called midnight and one called noon. Note for midnight, we have called the default constructor by saying new time type with no parameters. In this case, it will call the default constructor, which initialized all of the variables to 0, 0, 0, or the case that it is midnight. For noon, we have declared a new instance, where the hour is 12, the minute is 0, and the second is 0, or noon. That is the end of this worked example.